Adults have certain advantages and disadvantages in learning a foreign language. They have lost that sort of inherent part of the brain that helps process language input so efficiently. But on the other hand, we can think abstractly. We can look at structure, talk about cultural context. These are things that can really aid an adult language learner in approaching a difficult language like Chinese.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. I'm Dan Gable, Technology Manager for the LRC. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language, we are joined by Stephanie Divo, Senior Lecturer in Asian Studies and Language Program Director of Mandarin Chinese. Stephanie talks about her program's two-pronged approach to teaching beginning Chinese, fact and act.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Today, I am joined by my colleague, Stephanie Divo. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Angelica, for having me.
Absolutely. This is wonderful. So today we want to talk about the Chinese program's approach to language teaching. But before we get started, can you share with us a little bit about your journey with language learning and how did you end up with Chinese?
Okay, sure. My mother was a French teacher, so I early on developed an interest in language learning, and it was very valued in my household growing up. I started with French in junior high school and added German to that in high school, as well as a little bit of Latin.
Wow.
In high school, I also became interested in Eastern philosophy, particularly Taoism and Buddhism. And when I was deciding where to go to college, I decided that I wanted to learn an Asian language in order to get more insight into the ways of thought. Chinese particularly was a little bit of a fortuitous situation because my first year of college, the institution that I went to only offered Japanese every other year, and I came in on the off year. So my only choice was Chinese. Later on, I did, having taken both languages in the long run, I knew that Chinese was the choice for me, although both languages are wonderful to learn.
Wow, that's great. So you mentioned in some earlier conversations with me that the Chinese program's approach to teaching language, especially at the lower levels, is a little bit different from how many other languages here at Cornell run. Can you tell us more about the Chinese program, about how the language is taught? If you can also share with us how many students are in the program. So all the things about Chinese here.
Sure. I believe this semester we have around 250 students in all of our courses.
Yeah, that's great. And
we offer a variety of courses for students with a variety of needs. Yes, our approach is a bit different from the approach used in other languages at Cornell, although it has a lot in common with some of the other Asian language programs at Cornell, particularly Japanese.
Okay.
In fact, one of the originators of our teaching approach was Eleanor Jordan, who was a professor of linguistics here at Cornell and focused on Japanese and Japanese language pedagogy. And our approach is sort of evolved out of her original idea of how Asian languages particularly should be taught. And the basis has sort of two parts to it. One is that Chinese is what Jordan referred to as a truly foreign language vis-a-vis English-speaking learners. Because it has no common roots. And it has a lot of, the Asian languages, Chinese in particular, has a lot of characteristics that simply don't exist
Sure.
in European languages.
Yep.
So there are no familiar road signs along the way when a learner is dealing with Chinese, as there are, say if they're an English language learner is learning Spanish,
Sure,
or even German.
Yeah.
So that requires us to approach things in a certain way. We also are looking at teaching adult learners language as opposed to children.
Sure.
Learning, either their first or their second language. And adults have certain advantages and disadvantages in learning a foreign language. They have lost that sort of inherent part of the brain that helps them process language input so efficiently that kids can really develop excellent accents.
Just soaking it all up.
Yes, and but on the other hand, we can think abstractly, and we can look at structure and talk about cultural context, and these are things that can really aid an adult language learner in approaching a difficult language like Chinese.
Yeah.
So I'll start with our beginning level, which is sort of the most illustrative of our approach. It's divided into two parts. I should add here, I'm talking about students coming in learning Chinese from absolute zero, because we have two beginning groups in Chinese language at Cornell. We have the heritage learners. We have a large number of students with some Chinese heritage who were exposed to the language from an early age to varying degrees. Maybe they spoke Chinese at home. They may have gone to weekend school and also learned to read and write. Some of them heard Chinese growing up. Maybe their parents spoke to them in Chinese, but they answered back in English. We have all sorts of variations on the situation. So many different students go into that heritage group. But then we have the non-heritage students who have had no previous exposure to Chinese, didn't have any family experience with it. And that's the group I'm talking about. That's I'm basically in charge of the beginning level. And that we sometimes call them the true beginners because they're really starting from zero. So in our curriculum for true beginners, we have a two-pronged approach. We call it fact and act. So we have fact classes in which we use English to introduce the grammar and the cultural context of the language. And then we have the act classes, which are where the students take the linguistic knowledge that they're accumulating and use it in meaningful context to actually communicate.
Nice, yeah.
And so the ACT classes are the majority of the time students spend in class. So, for example, our regular beginning course is quite intensive. It's 7 hours a week.
Wow.
2 of those hours are lecture, and that's the fact portion of the course. And the other 5 are ACT classes, and they're entirely in Chinese.
Oh, great.
Basically from the first day.
Wow.
Our students have some time to prepare for that first class, and we talk about how to get ready for it. But it's all Chinese all the time. No English or any other languages allowed.
Nice. How does that go for the students? I can imagine the first couple of times that might be confusing and information overload. But how quickly do they get used to that immersive environment? I think they adapt
fairly quickly. Our students are really good here at Cornell. We're very fortunate. Sometimes think we're spoiled. And it is a little intimidating at first, but the teachers, especially in the first few classes, are very skilled at walking the students through the situation and giving them all the support they need to operate entirely in Chinese. Of course, they're not, they're doing just little things to start with, greetings and goodbyes, and then they work up from there. but it's amazing how much they can do entirely in the target language, entirely in the language that they're learning, with no recourse to English at all.
That's great.
And I think they really develop a strong feeling of accomplishment from that.
Oh, of course, yeah.
It is, as I said, it's a little intimidating at first, but they quickly get used to it. And our ACT classes are very small. It's a maximum of 12 students per class.
Nice.
So it's often smaller than that. They get to know their classmates really well. Very often it becomes their favorite class at Cornell because it is so much smaller. They get to know everybody well. And although, there's some pressure there, it's also a lot of fun. It's often funny as well, and there's often a lot of laughter in the class. It's very active.
Good.
You have to be paying attention at all times, so nobody's ever bored.
Yeah.
And so it's not easy necessarily, but it can still be fun.
That's wonderful. Well, it's great that the students have a positive learning experience. Do you know, do some of the students then, once they're done with Chinese, do they maybe take another Asian language, or do
Very often, you may be thinking of one student in particular who took both beginning Chinese and beginning Japanese at the same time. I do not recommend this, by the way, for most people. Now, he did very well, but what I do, very often students do take more than one Asian language at Cornell. I did it myself as an undergraduate.
Okay.
What I recommend is that they take at least a couple of years in the first one before they start on the second one. That way you're a little bit less likely to have interference from one language to the other.
Yeah,
sure. And in fact, the student that I'm thinking of had been exposed to Chinese previously before college. Yeah. And I think that probably helped.
Sure.
I would, there is one other aspect of our program that I should mention.
Yeah.
Because there are these aspects of Chinese that just don't exist in a lot of the languages our students are coming in with, we have to draw their attention to those aspects.
Sure.
And that means that, obviously, that's something that the fact class is very good about.
Yeah.
Because it's not something that, we can talk to them explicitly about in Chinese yet. They wouldn't understand.
Yeah.
But also we do a lot of explicit correction. So in our ACT classes, one of the teacher's main jobs is correction.
Okay.
And, you mentioned how the students react to the ACT class.
Yeah.
And that can be a little intimidating at first.
Sure.
Our teachers are very good. They're very diplomatic about correction. But you do have to be clear as well.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with a tonal language for the first time.
Oh, of course.
A lot of that linguistic information is going to go under your radar. As an English speaker, you deal with sentence level intonation. But in Chinese, every single word has its own tone. And so that the tones in Chinese are lexical information, not just emotional information, for example. So students have to have their attention drawn to that constantly, and they have to have that at the forefront of their minds whenever they're speaking, especially at the beginning level. Eventually, it will become second nature.
Yeah.
But at the start, you really need a lot of explicit correction. You will make tonal mistakes. It's part of the process.
Well,
we all went through it.
Yep. In any language, you make mistakes. Absolutely.
Oh, yes. And we believe in explicit correction. It has to be done diplomatically. It's not, no, you're wrong. But
sure. Yeah.
The teacher will say whatever the student's trying to say the right way, and the student then can repeat that and get a feel for how it sounds the right way.
Yeah.
As time goes on, we can give students just little prompts, and very often they can correct themselves. And
nice.
That's the ideal.
Yeah.
But very often you do simply have to say, okay, no, this is the right way to say it, and then, have them repeat that.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of students a little getting used to, because in previous language classes that they've had, maybe they weren't corrected at all. Some language teachers feel that it's bad to correct students. we feel that, we wouldn't be responsible if we didn't correct our students. And part of it may be, the just that truly foreign nature of Chinese vis-a-vis our English language speaking students. But we find that explicit correction is
it works,
the most efficient way to go about it.
So this two-prong approach with fact and act, is that limited to just the first year of instruction?
Yes. In Chinese it is, because we get through basic grammar in Chinese in that first year.
Okay.
Chinese grammar is fairly simple relative to other languages. That doesn't mean it's easy, but it doesn't include a lot of the things that we associate with grammars in Western languages, for example, but even in a lot of Asian languages. No conjugation, no declension. We don't even have general plurals for nouns in Chinese. No gender, none of those things. There are Chinese people will even sometimes say that Chinese doesn't have grammar because as learners of foreign languages to them, European languages, they associate grammar with all of those things, conjugation, declension, gender, and Chinese doesn't have them. But of course, Chinese does have structure that you have to learn, and that structure sometimes is similar to English and sometimes is very different. And where it's different, our students are required to start thinking in a whole different way. And that has to be explicitly taught. But they're done with that because they're, the basic grammar is fairly simple. They're done with that after the first year. Of course, that's a first year of 7 hours of class a week. So by the second year, it's all Chinese all the time in class.
Okay.
And at that point, the teacher can begin to explain any structural issues in Chinese.
That's great.
And usually they do that by generous provision of examples. Outside of class, the student also has recourse to grammar explanations in English in a textbook.
Sure. Yep.
But they can, at that point, keep the English out of the classroom for the most part. So it's conversation entirely in Chinese from second year on up.
That's wonderful. Great. Well, yeah, I personally think that's the way to learn language, as much immersion as possible.
Yeah, one thing I would say is in order to create that Chinese-only classroom, there is a lot of work behind the scenes that the students have to do.
Yeah.
And I was, when I was thinking about what I was going to say for this podcast, one of the things that came up in my mind was the sort of the evolution of language pedagogy as it's envisioned by American teachers of English and of foreign languages. This idea that we sort of originally started and had for many centuries this sort of grammar translation approach, followed by mid 20th century audiolingual method, and then now we have communicative language teaching, which is far superior to that in this vision. But I think all three of those approaches come into play. You can't simply reject the drills of the audiolingual method or the structural focus in grammar translation when you're getting students to communicate. So in their preparation for class, our students are, they're looking at structure in the fact class. They're doing drills using our interactive audio materials to get ready for class.
The interaction in the classroom.
And then in the classroom, they're actually using that information to communicate meaningfully. So I think all of those approaches, you're not really rejecting the past completely for this method that we're using now. It's really cumulative. We're using all three of those approaches.
That's very interesting. Well, I'm glad to hear that this is a successful approach for the Chinese program here. Sounds like a very engaging classroom.
We try to make it that.
yeah. I actually need to stop by sometime and take a look at. I mean, I won't understand a thing.
That's okay. You can actually, you'll get a sense of what the conversation is about.
Yeah.
And even if you don't know exactly what all the words mean.
Yeah.
And that would be great. You'd be welcome to come sit in on a class.
Wonderful. Well, this was a great introduction to the Chinese program here at Cornell. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
And speaking of immersive environments, next week, Darren Borders will join us on our podcast. Darren is the Residence Hall Director of Cornell's Language House, and we will talk about how students immerse themselves in a language as part of this residential program. Until then, auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu or look for Cornell LRC on Facebook and Twitter. Speaking of Language is produced by Sam Lupowitz and Dan Gable. Recorded by Sam Lupowitz. Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson. Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University. As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University. We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.